Almost all old files begin with a date, a name, and a place. The Hollowpine dossier begins with an absence. 46 men did not return. This is how, more than a century later, the case comes into the hands of the researcher who narrates this story, sitting in front of dusty boxes in the basement of a small county archive near the region known on old maps as Ozark Divide. As you listen, write in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. These details of where the case is heard today remind the researcher of how time spreads over the same event. In 1902, Hollowpine was not exactly a city. It was more of a crossroads, a passing point between dense pine slopes and narrow valleys where the wind seemed to walk straight across the mountain ridges. Some maps called the place Hollowpine Settlement, others didn't even name it. They just marked a circle in pencil and wrote small community of woodcutters and hunters. It was one of those places that existed less on paper and more in the memory of those who passed through. In the center of this quasi-place lived the Hollowpine sisters, Ada, Miriam, and Elise. All three bore the surname of a father whom most of the older residents still remembered as a strict but predictable figure. A man of few words, good with wood, hard on his daughters, respected for keeping his land and livestock in order. When he died a few years before the Great Disappearance, what was left behind was not only the light-colored wooden house and the sloping barn, but also a portion of land cut by an ancient stone basin, half natural, half man-made, what later records would call the Binding Basin. The Binding Basin was basically a circular stone depression, fed by a trickle of water that descended from the hillside and accumulated there before flowing through a small ditch toward the valley. It was shallow in some places, deep in others, with irregular walls, as if someone had started digging a well, and, at some point, had left the work to erosion itself. For the itinerant hunters who crossed that part of the Ozarks, the basin had a simple function: water for the horses, rest for the muscles, a place to wash their hands stained with the blood of their prey and let their boots dry for a few minutes. The sisters grew up in the shadow of that stone tank. Ada, the eldest, was the one who dealt with papers and numbers. It was her name that appeared on property records, milk sales receipts, and timber contracts. Miriam, the middle sister, was described in a medical report as the most robust of the three, but reserved, with attentive eyes. Elise, the youngest, appeared almost always in indirect references, in letters from travelers, in the diaries of itinerant teachers who spent only one winter in the region. The most talkative of the Hollowpines, wrote one of these teachers, but never about herself. The researcher, leafing through these documents, realizes that the sisters only appear clearly in a specific decade, between 1892 and 1902. Before that, there are only one or two mentions of the Hollowpine family as a whole. After 1902, references to the three women almost disappear. There are no marriage, change, or death certificates for any of them in the county archives. What exists instead is a silent sequence of land records, as if the properties that belonged to them had simply been renegotiated with other surnames, without explaining what had happened to the previous owners. At the beginning of the century, Hollowpine was a destination for many hunters who traveled long distances between valleys, following the trail of deer, bears, and small game that provided food and some money. The region was known for hunting seasons that lasted for weeks, sometimes months. Groups of men would set out in early fall, with loaded wagons and promises to return before the end of winter. Many of them passed through Hollowpine, leaving salted meat in exchange for fresh bread, paying a few coins for milk, asking for hot water for coffee. In the accounts of those who survived that era, the sisters are described with a mixture of respect and distance. They kept the place quiet, noted an ammunition merchant who visited Hollowpine twice. There was no laughter on the porch, but there was order. The fence was tight. The corral was clean. The laundry was always hung out in the same way. The sisters' names do not appear in the baptismal register of the nearest small church. They lived on the margins of the community, although they depended on it to sell milk, eggs, and occasionally cut wood. The climate, according to witnesses of that winter of 1902, is described as drier than usual. The rains were slow to fall, and the wind that descended the slopes brought fine dust and a constant smell of old leaves. The sun, when it passed through the tall pine trees, seemed dim, as if it arrived tired at the ground. At night, darkness came early, and reports mention a thick silence, broken only by the crackling of branches and from time to time by an isolated shot in the distance. This was the setting in which the Hollowpine sisters moved daily. Ada, making small deals with hunters. Miriam driving cows and goats to a safe spot near the stone basin. Elise lighting the fire in the kitchen, preparing broths, bread, weak coffee. The researcher is able to reconstruct part of this routine from scattered notes, shopping lists, church notes, unfinished letters. There are no direct quotes from the sisters, but there is a sketch of their movements, like shadows fixed on paper. It is also at this stage that records begin to show an increase in the flow of hunters through the region. After 1898, the routes intensify. War veterans in search of work, men who left the larger cities to try their luck with skins and meat sold to distant markets, young people attracted by stories of abundant animals in the Ozarks valleys. The trail that passes through Hollowpine gradually becomes an essential artery of passage. And Binding Basin, the resting point where many of these men stopped before heading into the woods. The researcher, when aligning the dates in the field notebooks, notices something that, at first glance, seems like a coincidence. The more hunters appear in the notes, the more frequent are small mentions of arguments, delays, and temporary disappearances. A hunter who took longer than agreed to return to the group. Another who took a different trail and only joined the others days later. Fragments of sentences in notes. He didn't come back last night, but maybe he took the northern route. They said he slept near the basin. He stayed behind talking to the middle sister, I think. However, in the set of official documents, sheriff's reports, incident records, community meeting minutes, the great disappearance of the 46 hunters appears almost all at once, as if it had happened en masse, in a single period of weeks. There is no gradual build-up to this tragedy in the public records. Rather, there is a sudden statement. 46 men left in hunting parties using the Hollowpine route. Only a small number returned. The rest are listed as missing. This is where the researcher finds the first real oddity in the archives. At the bottom of a box, among yellowed documents, there is a hardcover notebook identified as Passage and Stop Record Book, 1901-1903. On the last pages, a note in hurried handwriting clearly states, Binding Basin, 46 men, last known location. But just below that sentence, there is a thick line of dark ink covering the rest of the line. Turning the page, the researcher notices that the next page has been carefully torn out, leaving only a shred of the spine. The case of the 46 hunters who disappeared near Ozark Divide, which the public would come to know years later only as the story of the Hollowpine sisters and Binding Basin, thus begins in this void. An interrupted record, a torn-out page, and a crossed-out note that seems to attempt to erase not only a name, but an entire sequence of events. It is from this silent point, this absence of paper where there should be an explanation, that the investigator decides to reconstruct, step by step, life in Hollowpine in the days leading up to the disappearance. Because, as he noted in pencil in the margin of one of the documents, if the page that tells what happened has been torn out, what remains on the previous pages may still speak. To understand the disappearance of the 46 hunters, the researcher quickly realizes that he needs to look back, not just to the days leading up to the event, but to the years when the Hollowpine sisters lived almost invisible to the community. Hollowpine was too isolated for big secrets, but quiet enough to allow small oddities to go unnoticed until it was too late. The oldest accounts describe the sisters' routine with surprising accuracy. Ada would wake before sunrise, light the fire with her face still marked by sleep, and take care of the first tasks of the day, separating milk, checking that the goats were secure, peering at the weather through the narrow window. She was always the one who made deals with travelers and hunters. Perhaps because she was the oldest, perhaps because she was the only one who would look strangers in the eye without hesitation. Some men who passed through the property noted that she had an air of quiet authority, not arrogant, but firm. Miriam, the middle child, did what the land demanded. She carried firewood, carried buckets, herded animals, and tended the garden. She was more observant than talkative. There is a letter from 1899, written by a hunter from Kansas who had spent 3 nights camping near the basin, in which he describes seeing Miriam standing in front of the water while the wind blew strongly, as if she were trying to decipher something on the motionless surface. He could not explain what exactly made him uncomfortable about that scene. He simply wrote, "It seemed as if she wanted to listen to the water." Elise, the youngest, was the most talkative, but always about things that did not concern herself. She liked to ask travelers questions. Where are you from? How many days of hiking are left? Is there enough food for the coming cold weather? In indirect accounts, she appears as a kind of delicate bridge between the house and the outside world, although she rarely strayed far from her family's land. The researcher suspects that Elise was the one who mentally organized the stories of each man who passed by, and perhaps that is why her presence appeared so often in the memories of others, even though she left almost nothing in writing. The sisters' daily life followed an almost ritualistic rhythm. Busy mornings, afternoons of work, quiet evenings. There were no community parties, no constant visits, no deep bonds with their closest neighbors. Still, no one described them as hostile. On the contrary, hard-working people, serious women, house always in order. But there were also more ambiguous statements, coming from people who had only passed through the region for a few hours. A note in a 1900 diary reads, "The Hollowpine house always seems ready for something. I don't know what, but something." It is a loose phrase, yet one laden with unease. Binding Basin, the physical center of the family's lands, was also the point where most stories intersected. It was there that hunters rested, where some washed their wounds, where others left fresh footprints that would be seen days later by different travelers. Researchers find old maps indicating the place with precision. The basin was a few minutes' walk from the house, in an area surrounded by tall pine trees that cast irregular shadows throughout the day. The sound of running water, faint but continuous, could be heard even from inside the kitchen on quiet days. The researcher notes that, over the years, the presence of hunters becomes more constant, and, along with it, small tensions begin to arise. In a statement taken in 1931, an old man recalls that some hunting groups had a habit of arguing among themselves about which route to take, and that leadership problems occurred frequently. "The basin was peaceful," he says, "but the men rarely were." Another, interviewed in 1924, recalls a night when he heard gunshots in the distance and in the morning saw footprints near the edge of the sisters' land. He could not identify whose they were, but said they seemed disordered, as if someone were in a hurry. There are also reports that mention small, unexplained delays. One hunter stayed behind after helping Miriam repair a fence. Another decided to sleep near the basin after talking with Elise until late. Some returned to their groups days later. Others were not mentioned again. But until 1902, these scattered disappearances did not attract enough attention. They were attributed to the cold, getting lost, recklessness, or disputes between men who lived for weeks in the woods. The researcher, in piecing together these fragments of memory, notices a pattern. Binding Basin was not just a resting place. It was a meeting place, and, for some, a temporary home. Many men reported sleeping there alone, trusting that the sisters, though reserved, kept the area relatively safe. And for some still unclear reason, this sense of security seemed to increase in the months leading up to the Great Disappearance. September 1902 was described by several travelers as a month of dry air and long nights. The forest seemed to absorb sound more than usual. Hunters passing through the property noted that the Hollowpine house had a constant smell of damp wood and soup. Some mentioned seeing Ada watching the trail for long periods, as if waiting for someone or something. A particularly intriguing account appears in a letter dated September 9th of that year, written by a traveler who claimed to have spent an evening in the basin. The excerpt reads, "I saw movement near the house. I can't explain it, but there was something strange about the way the three of them stood, as if they were always with their backs to each other yet connected. When they noticed my presence, only Elise waved. The other two watched me as if they were evaluating something I didn't yet know about myself." This statement has never been explained, but it indicates that month there was something different in the sisters' behavior, or perhaps it was just the perception of someone who was tired and impressionable. The researcher does not state conclusions. He only highlights patterns. The fact is that, at that point, the hunters crossing Hollowpine were greater in number than in any other recorded year. There was plenty in the valleys, and word had spread. The men set out in large groups, bringing with them salted meat, sharp knives, and promises to return with full wagons. And inevitably they stopped at Binding Basin before continuing on the trails that cut through the pine trees. The last section of the 1902 logbook, before the disappearances began, contains a loose note, written in the margin of an official document, possibly by someone who organized the archive at the time. In fine handwriting, almost erased by time, it reads, "If there was a sign, it started here." The sentence ends there, without explanation. But when the researcher found it, he knew he was standing at the exact point where history ceased to be mere routine and became an enigma. And it is precisely from this silent month, fraught with minimal movements and growing unease, that the reports enter their darkest period, the sequence of days when the 46 men passed through the basin for the last time. The researcher notes that the days leading up to the disappearance of the 46 hunters have a disturbing pattern. All of the last confirmed mentions of the men are located in the region between the Hollowpine sisters' house and Binding Basin. There is no significant variation in route, no witnesses claiming to have seen any of them following another trail. Everything converges on that narrow point in the landscape, as if the geography itself had funneled the group's fate. The dates in the field notebooks, carefully aligned, show that the first groups passed through Hollowpine in the last week of September 1902. They were experienced men, many from Arkansas and Missouri, accustomed to long hunting seasons. Most made the same stop. They left their wagons just above the valley, walked to the sisters' house to exchange a few words, ask for water, and, when they were well received, a little bread or hot broth. Then they continued on to the basin to rest. Records of their conversations with the sisters are scarce, but some have survived. A hunter named Owen Thatch wrote in his diary, "Ada seemed restless, as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Miriam, in the background, just watched, holding a bucket with strange firmness. And Elise asked me if I would return to the basin before nightfall. I found it curious, because it was already late, and she seemed to want to know the exact time I would be going down there." This excerpt, dated September 28th, is considered by the researcher to be one of the first indicators that something in the dynamic between the sisters and the hunters had changed. There is nothing explicit, nothing accusatory, just a series of gestures, glances, questions, and silences that, years later, would take on new meaning. The night of the 29th brings the first unusual noise. In statements taken decades later, 2 residents reported hearing shots coming from the woods. It was not a burst of gunfire, it was 3 isolated shots, with long pauses between them. It did not seem like a confrontation, it seemed like a signal. The researcher notes, 3 spaced shots, 3 sisters. But he also writes alongside it, "Coincidence is not evidence." Still, that same night, the wind changed direction. This is mentioned in at least 4 testimonies. The pine trees creaked, dry leaves rustled unevenly on the ground, and the darkness seemed denser than usual. Some men who were camping 2 kilometers from the basin claimed to have heard footsteps in the woods, slow and heavy, but unable to determine whether they were from animals or people. The next day, the first group of hunters disappeared. From what the documents allow us to reconstruct, they arrived at Binding Basin between the morning and afternoon of September 30th. The weather was dry, almost still, and the basin reflected the sky perfectly. They were seen there by 2 other travelers. These, who would survive to tell the tale, gave minimal details. Tired men, talking quietly, cleaning knives, washing their hands in the warm water of the rock. Nothing unusual. The researcher pauses at a short sentence in this account. They seem to be waiting for someone. That someone was never identified. The second group passed by on October 1st, others on the 2nd, and a few more on the 3rd. All were last seen near the basin or walking toward it. None of the 46 were officially seen beyond that point. And curiously, in all the accounts involving these men, the same final piece of information always appears. They descended toward the land of Hollowpine. There is one detail that official records have tried to downplay. The distance between the sisters' house and the basin was short, but there was no direct line of sight. Between one point and the other, the trail narrowed and made a long curve through the pine trees. Anything that happened there would be invisible to anyone on the property or on any other trail. The researcher draws this section on the map and circles the area. There, he says, the path bends back on itself. No one sees who enters, no one sees who leaves. On the afternoon of October 2nd, a lone traveler claimed to have seen something that, although simple, would attract attention when revisited years later. He described Miriam walking toward the basin, carrying 2 buckets full of water. Something unusual, since the basin was naturally fed by a constant stream. Why bring water to a place that always had water? The testimony was considered irrelevant at the time. Today, the researcher points out, strange movement on the most critical day. Another report, this one from October 3rd, mentions that Elise was standing at the door of the house at dawn, staring at the trail. When the traveler passed by, she asked, "How many are in your group?" He replied that there were 3. She shook her head as if calculating something, sighed and muttered, "The others were many." This excerpt, noted from memory 17 years later, is the closest the archives come to a direct statement suggesting awareness of the facts. The weather worsened from that day on. Hot winds blew, carrying dust and dry leaves. The pine trees bent as if something heavy were passing through the forest. At night, hunters in nearby regions saw distant lights moving toward the Hollowpine property. Lights that looked like lanterns, but flickered on and off irregularly, as if carried by trembling hands. The silence in the basin grew thicker. The water, according to one account, smelled different, with a metallic odor and damp earth. A traveler claimed to have seen boot marks on the edge of the rock, many and overlapping, as if several men had been there at the same time. But when he returned the next day, the marks had disappeared under a thin layer of dust. All these accounts form a fragmented mosaic. Nothing is conclusive, nothing is straightforward, but taken together, they point to a period of growing tension and a sequence of unusual movements on the Hollowpine family's land. On October 4th, the last confirmed group arrived in the region. They were 6 men from Tennessee. They were seen talking to Ada, who looked exhausted. One of them wrote in his notebook, "She held her hands as if trying to hide them." Another wrote, "Miriam didn't talk to me. She just followed me with her eyes until I walked away." And a third mentioned that Elise offered them food without them asking, an unusual gesture for the sisters. These 6 men headed for Binding Basin at 4 p.m. that day. They were never seen again. The researcher follows the confirmed final minutes of these men as if following shadows in an old movie. They walked along the narrow trail. They descended the curve where the pine trees blocked the view. They took knives, flashlights, and 3 bags of provisions. One of them carried a notebook, the same one found years later, wet, with half of its pages illegible. In that notebook, only 2 sentences could be recovered. "We are hearing something on the other side." And just below, "It must be nothing." From then on, silence dominates the records. No bodies were found, no weapons, no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains. The basin remained intact, the water clean, the trail silent. But the next day, when the community realized that so many men had disappeared, someone finally decided to look for the sisters. The house was open. The table was set. The fireplace was lit. And there was no sign of them. In the sheriff's diary, there is only one last note before the case was officially opened. The back door led to the trail to the basin. There were footprints, many, but I couldn't tell which ones belonged to whom, and the wind erased the rest. This is where the researcher closes the document folder and notes, everything converges on a single point. Binding Basin was the known end, but perhaps not the real end. The next step is to understand how the community reacted when it realized that these were not just isolated disappearances, but a collective tragedy unprecedented in the Ozarks. The simultaneous disappearance of so many men, 46 according to the number that was consolidated in official reports, was not immediately apparent. The nature of the region, the distance between groups, and the irregular pace of the hunts meant that, in the early days, the absence of each of them was interpreted as a delay, a change of route, or even internal quarrels. Hunters were men accustomed to disappearing for days and reappearing without explanation. However, when the fourth day arrived and none of them returned to the agreed meeting point, the tension ceased to be rumor and became fact. The community, small and accustomed to the quiet routine of the valleys, reacted first with confusion. The families, realizing that there was no news, sent messengers to different trails. Travelers began asking each other if they had seen large groups moving. Nothing. It was as if an entire river of men had entered the forest and never touched the shore again. The county sheriff, George Colton, a man in his 50s, known for his patient demeanor and his firm belief that almost everything had a rational explanation, took his horse and maps and set out along the known routes. He was the one who realized that all the reports converged on the same point, Binding Basin and the trail that led straight to the Hollowpine sisters' land. When Colton arrived at the property, something immediately unsettled him. The house wasn't abandoned. It was interrupted. The table with dishes, the stove with hot ashes, a kettle still warm, a chair fallen in the corner, as if someone had gotten up too quickly. There was no sign of a struggle, but there was a silence so abnormal that it seemed to press on his chest. The sheriff called the sisters by name. Ada, Miriam, Elise. No answer. He circled the house and found the doors open, but the windows locked from the inside. The orderliness of the residence contrasted with the chaos of absence. The sheriff's journal records. It didn't look like they ran away. It looked like they were taken from the house by something more urgent than fear. The neighbors arrived on the scene shortly after, forming small groups with flashlights, dogs, and wooden stakes used as clubs. They searched the woods, peered into the basin, and looked for signs in the surrounding area. Binding Basin was strangely clean. No tears in the vegetation, no drag marks. The water seemed clearer than usual, as if it had been renewed that morning. An older hunter commented, "It's as if someone had carefully erased the tracks." From that point on, rumors began to surface. Some said they had seen the sisters walking hurriedly the day before. Others swore they were nervous, that something was bothering them. A woman from the community reported that Elise had come to her house weeks earlier to ask for salt and sugar, nothing unusual, but that as she left she had said, "We won't always be able to help. Sometimes it's better to just pass by." The meaning of this sentence only gained weight later. The researcher, analyzing these late reports, observes how human memory shapes the past according to the need for explanation. Rumors are not evidence, he notes, but he immediately adds, when all rumors point in the same direction, there is a kind of truth in that set. The official search lasted 10 days. Groups combed ravines, trails, clearings, shallow caves, and dry creeks. Nothing. The men seemed to have vanished into thin air. The county sent letters to other regions, asking for help in identifying possible new paths the hunters might have taken. No useful responses were received, but a single clue emerged. And it is this clue that the researcher considers the most significant revelation of the case. On the 8th day of searching, one of the teams found a notebook partially buried under dry leaves. The cover was damp, the edges eaten away by water, but it was still possible to read some passages. The notebook is believed to have belonged to the group of 6 men from Tennessee, the last to be seen alive. The best preserved passage read, "Something is wrong. The trail is too quiet. The wind has changed. The basin doesn't look the same. We found boot prints, but there are too many and we don't recognize any of them. The sisters said they would be home before dark. We haven't seen them since. On another page, this one more blurred, was the phrase, "If anything happened, it was between the house and the basin," and just below, words that were almost indecipherable, but clear enough for the researcher to venture an interpretation: "Don't follow. If you hear." The rest of the sentence was destroyed by water. This document, although fragmented, reinforced the belief that something very specific happened in that narrow stretch between the sisters' property and Binding Basin. Something quick, silent, efficient enough to eliminate any possibility of resistance. But what? The researcher insists nothing in the records points to explicit violence, organized ambushes, armed conflict, wild animals, or unexplained phenomena. All that remains are silences. And it is precisely at this point that the most significant emotional revelation of the case emerges, not by providing answers, but by reformulating the questions. On the 10th night of the search, Sheriff Colton returned to the Hollowpine house alone. He reports feeling that there was still something there, something that was not in the reports. Upon entering, he noticed that all of the sisters' belongings were still in place. Almost everything was intact, except for one thing. In Ada's room, there was an open drawer containing papers written with extreme care. They were lists, names, dates, times, hunters coming and going. But they were not business records. There were no values, exchanges, or practical notes. They were just names marked with simple symbols, circles, lines, dots. After studying them for weeks, the researcher concluded that Ada, or one of the other sisters, kept track of the flow of men through the region with a precision that no one could have imagined. The papers showed that they knew exactly how many had passed through, how many had returned, and how many had stayed in the basin longer than they should have. These lists do not indicate guilt. They indicate awareness. "I don't know if they tried to prevent something," writes the researcher, "or if they were just observing the inevitable." The fact that none of the three left any direct message, any clear trace, increases the feeling that for them, those notes had their own meaning, a meaning that was lost with their absence. The revelation that this material provokes in the narrative is not an answer to the mystery, but a deep understanding of the tragedy. The sisters knew. Perhaps they did not know what. Perhaps they did not fully understand. But they knew that something was happening gradually, increasingly, silently. And by all accounts, they were trying to follow this movement, not provoke it. The block ends with the question that the researcher writes at the end of his analysis, perhaps without realizing that it would echo for decades. If they knew something was happening, why did they stay? And what did they see on the trail that last night that made them disappear too? These questions, to which the archives have never provided answers, pave the way for the final reflection, the silent epilogue that closes the Hollowpine case. Many decades have passed since the Hollowpine case ceased to be just a collection of scattered documents and became, for researchers and residents of the region, a kind of persistent absence, an echo that never dissipated. With each generation, someone returned to the archives, the old trails, the banks of Binding Basin, trying to find a fragment that would explain what happened in 1902. And yet none of these efforts brought definitive answers. At most, they brought new layers of silence. The researcher who narrates this case, now elderly, his hands marked by ink and paper, confesses in his last note that he returned several times to the ruins of the Hollowpine sisters' house. Today, almost nothing remains. A few stones from the foundation, a section of the fence, a piece of wood still firm, though corroded by time. The wind continues to blow through the valley with the same slowness as in the old descriptions, and the smell of damp pine still seems to carry, in some way, part of the life that once passed through there. He writes that, in his solitary visits, he never found any physical traces that could be attributed to the 46 men or the sisters, but he found something else, a feeling that is difficult to name. It is not fear, nor is it unease. It is something deeper, as if the land knew more than the archives and yet refused to speak. Binding Basin remains in the same place, fed by the same stream of water that flows down the slopes. The stone, marked by time, has the same irregular shape described in the 1902 reports. The researcher says that, as he approached the basin on an autumn afternoon, he noticed how the landscape seemed to adjust to the silence, as if what was missing was as old as what was present. He stared at the water for several minutes, trying to imagine how many men had washed their hands there, how many voices had crossed that clearing, how many footsteps had gone unnoticed on the trail connecting the basin to the house. He writes, "Anyone looking at the landscape today might believe that nothing happened, but it is precisely this apparent repose that reveals the absence." In the archives, he separated 3 sheets that he considers the most revealing, not because they provide concrete evidence, but because they expose what remains of what was not understood. The first is a piece of the notebook found in the woods. The phrase, "if you hear," blurred by time. The second is the list of names written by Ada, annotated with symbols that have never been deciphered. And the third is a letter from 1938, written by one of the last residents who still remembered the sisters. In it, the man says, "They were not guilty, but they were not innocent either. They knew more than they could bear, and when no one understood, they remained silent." This silence, according to the researcher, is the key that runs through the entire narrative. It is not a silence of omission, nor of fear. It is the silence of those who live in a world where there is not always language for what one sees. He suggests that something, a pattern, a repetition, a movement that can only be perceived by those who live daily with the land, was slowly approaching, and the sisters, because they were there, felt it before the others. The researcher does not venture theories. He rejects any ready explanation. He does not attribute the disappearance to ambushes, conflicts, accidents, or anything extraordinary. Instead, he tries to reconstruct the human condition of the time, the loneliness of the valleys, the weight of daily work, the men who went weeks without being seen, the feeling that the forest absorbed everything, sounds, footsteps, intentions. In that region, the distance between what happened and what might have happened has always been too narrow. What drives him at the end of his research is not to solve the mystery, but to understand why it remains. And his conclusion is simple, though deeply profound. Cases like Hollowpine's stand the test of time because they are made of absences, and absences cannot be erased. They spread. He writes, "Perhaps the men did not disappear into the woods, but into the gap between what was seen and what could not be said." It is a phrase he repeats as he closes the archive boxes for the last time. Because for him, what is most striking about the case is not the lack of answers, but the lack of direct witnesses. The last people to see the hunters were also the ones who disappeared. The Hollowpine sisters are as central to the mystery as the valley itself, and yet they remained silent until the end. In the final years of his life, the researcher returns to the site one last time. He walks along the narrow trail, now overgrown with new bushes. The wind blows through the pine trees with the same deep sound described in old testimonies. He stops where the trail curves and writes in his notebook, "It's here. It's always here." Then he continues until he reaches the basin. The water is calm, no marks around it, no indication that 46 men and 3 women ever passed through here. The researcher takes a deep breath, as if searching the air for a memory he never had. Then he slowly closes his notebook. On the last line, left undated, he writes only, "Some places hold what time dares not reveal," and he adds nothing more.